What's going on, team? Welcome to the turbo installment video, which is the sequel to my turbo blow video. And if you didn't know, my 18G turbo failed spectacularly while on track. And if you have turbo fail on you, don't just replace it. There are things to do to prevent further damage, so check out that video. Now, if you're looking for guidance on how to replace your direct replacement turbo, this is the video for you. I say guidance because turbos come in all different shapes, sizes, and manufacturers. I will show you exactly what I did in replacing my turbo, along with general tips for replacing turbos. There will be timestamps in the description for you to reference, as well as my appreciation for your views, likes, and subscriptions. So let's get to it. You will need to know what kind of turbo you have in your car and how it relates to the turbo that you plan on putting in your car. Just because something is a stock or a direct replacement does not mean it will come with everything you need. Some turbos come with all the piping, gaskets, and lines you will need, and some don't. And if you buy one used, it's really anybody's guess. I strongly suggest getting a repair manual so you can at least have access to torque specs and the patterns. I'll post some in the video, but depending on your model, they may be different. Assuming you purchased the correct turbo type, you will need gaskets to match your up pipe and down pipe. Twin scroll, single scroll, 3-bolt or 2-bolt, and downpipe styles are important. You also need to know the bearing type of the old and new turbos. The type of bearing can determine what kind of oil feed line you need. My old ball bearing turbo called for this fitting, which is a type of metering device for oil flow. My new journal bearing style turbo calls for a banjo bolt fitting. You should also have new crush washers for your lines. Now, you can purchase an assortment of crush washers or copper fittings if you want to cover all your ends. Now, it may not be required, but I suggest picking up a foot of high pressure coolant hose and a foot of evap/emission hoses. These hoses break down over time, so you should replace them while you have the turbo out. And please do not try to use the coolant hose for oil lines. Another important note is that there are basically two methods to replace the turbo on an EJ257. One is by removing the intake manifold and downpipe, and the other is to keep them on. Now, if you're comfortable with working in tight spaces, have patience, and kind of a glutton for punishment, then you can keep them on like I did. The other option does require more work, but it shouldn't be as testing. And just know that you may need to replace the associated manifold gaskets. So I think that covers the prep side of things, and now we can take the car apart. The first thing you should do is spray the exhaust bolts that you plan on removing with a rust penetrant. On my car, there are 3 on the up pipe, 5 on the downpipe by the turbo, 1 downpipe hanger, and 2 connecting the downpipe to the mid pipe. Then remove the intercooler and intercooler piping. I find that if you remove this bracket first, it makes removal and installation a lot easier. The bypass valve can be removed from the intercooler, or you can remove the piping from the valve. Removing the piping will save you from wearing out the bypass valve gasket, because they can be removed and reused a couple of times before they start to wear and then you have to replace it. Now, I'll get back to that on the reassembly part of the video. With the intercooler removed, I suggest removing the passenger side intercooler bracket and the wastegate actuator assembly. Removing them will give you access to the up pipe and downpipe bolts. At this point, you can remove the intake manifold, and if you're going that route, remove your throttle cable if you have one, mark and then remove your vacuum lines and electrical connectors. To mark your lines and connectors, just take some masking tape, write down the component that they belong to, and fold it around like so. Once your connectors are labeled and out of the way, the intake manifold can be removed. Be sure to cover the intake ports on the head with tape so nothing falls into them. Now, whether if you took the intake manifold off or kept it on, we can move forward doing the same thing. You're going to put a catch pan under the car because you will spill some oil and coolant. Remove your turbo inlet hose clamp and the turbo coolant and oil lines. The oil return line for the turbo is on the bottom and it's in a pretty tight space. I use large needle nose pliers to undo the clamp on the engine side of the piping, and I leave that clamp on the piping. The hose gets removed with the turbo, so don't worry about taking off the upper clamp. And now you can remove the studs and nuts that hold in the turbo. I remove the downpipe fasteners first, which gives me easy access to the uppipe fasteners. If some of the studs come out because the nuts are rusted, don't worry about it, we can fix or replace them after the turbo is out. Now, if you completely remove the downpipe, the turbo should come right out. And if you didn't, you will have to push the downpipe away from the turbo as you lift on the turbo from the uppipe. Once the turbo clears the uppipe studs, you can remove the turbo from the car and everything is good to go. So before installing the new turbo, there are a couple of things that you should do and check. Check the compressor/turbine for play and for smooth rotation. You can do this with a dial indicator, which is a precise tool, or give it a light wiggle with your fingers. For the indicator, the allowed play will be determined by the turbo manufacturer. With the finger method, the play should be virtually undetectable. Confirm the spring weight of your wastegate actuator if you replaced it. Use a good hand pump to pressurize the actuator to see what pressure it starts to move. And depending on what your target boost is, you might have to adjust the actuator. The accepted norm is 1 turn equals 1 pound of change, but what you can do is you can try adjusting it until it opens at your target pressure. Next are the studs. The OEM studs are not symmetrical. There is a long end and a short end. The short end goes into the exhaust side of the turbo housing, and the long end extends towards the downpipe. Some turbos come with new studs and some don't. To remove or install the studs, you can use a stud removal/install tool, or you can use the double nut method. The double nut method is when you put 2 nuts on the end of the stud and tighten them against each other. Once they are tight, you can turn the bottom nut to loosen the stud, or turn the top nut to install the stud. Don't try to be Hercules because you'll end up damaging the threads. If your studs are dirty, you should definitely clean them. It takes less than 60 seconds with a wire brush and rust penetrant. And when installing them, just know that there is a non-threaded section, so just turn the studs in until they stop. And this is the point where I install the new oil return hose. This hose can be a pain to try to install, and honestly I'm not sure if it can be done when the turbo is fully bolted in the car. It's a 5/8 inch or 60mm evap/oil hose, and it's cut to roughly 10 centimeters or 4 inches. And you're going to attach one end to the turbo and make sure that your spring clamp is set in. Now make sure all of your fluid and hose fittings fit and are tight. Confirm there's no debris in the housing, and at this point the turbo should be ready for installation. Now before we put the turbo in, I want to address this filter. This is a filter for the oil supply line. It's not very serviceable and could get clogged over time, so I decided to remove it, but that's up to you. If it does stop something from getting into the turbo, whatever that thing is, it's going to stop oil from flowing to the turbo, which will ultimately damage the turbo anyway. The first thing I do is put my new gaskets in place. The uppipe gasket goes onto the uppipe, but the downpipe gasket goes onto the turbo. When lowering the turbo into position, make sure you align that oil return line correctly and that both of the spring clamps are in position. And once the turbo is resting on the uppipe, not torqued, check the coolant return line clearance. On my turbo, the fitment was very tight. Interference here can cause a very hard to detect, hard to reach leak, and I have first-hand experience. If your oil return and coolant lines are in good position, torque down the uppipe nuts and then attach the downpipe and torque those nuts. And I believe the torque is 31 foot-pounds, but make sure you check your manuals. So before I connect the oil feed line to the oil supply, which is on the engine, I connect the feed line to the turbo, and I use my oil can to prime the feed line and turbo with oil. This way I know the turbo is lubricated on startup. And at this point you can reinstall everything in reverse order. But here are 2 quick tips. Install the driver's side intercooler bracket last. Get everything connected and hand tightened, but not tight where you can't move it. Once everything is in position, then put the bracket in place and then torque everything down. I find that doing this makes it easier to attach all the intercooler piping and the throttle piping because it gets a little tight in there. The next tip is to pay attention to your bypass valve gaskets. Some OEM bypass valves have this port that requires this kind of gasket, and some aftermarket bypass valves or blow-up valves don't have that port, so they may use this kind of gasket. And try not to mix up the gaskets because it could possibly cause issues. And once it's all back together, you can change your oil and coolant, or you can top them off. I suggest changing your fluids just so you have a fresh start. Okay, now it's time for the test drive. But don't just start the car and start wailing on it. That is not a good idea. What you want to do is let the car idle for a while you check for leaks and make sure that there aren't any glaring issues. Now if all is good, take it for an easy ride. There will be smoke and smells coming from under the hood, and that's because fluids will get on the turbo and the exhaust. Now if the car continually smokes after about 2 heat cycles, you might have a leak. And if you do find a leak, just be cool. You're more familiar with the car now and you know where to look. So you can do it, just address the problem and you learn something else. Once it's all good, have fun and drive safely. So now let's talk about the specifics of my turbo. I changed my turbo from a Blausch Performance Turbo 18G XTR with a Blausch 20G XT turbo. The difference between the two is the size and the bearing type. The 18G was a TD05 housing and the 20G is a TD06. They both have 8 square centimeter exhaust inlets, but the 20G has a larger compressor housing. This raises my ceiling for max output capability but slows down my spooling. The new turbo has a journal bearing, which means the rolling resistance is a little higher, but journal bearings are usually more durable than ball bearings. I was going to get a different turbo, but manufacturing is backed up and I believe that's from all the COVID stuff, so the 20G was genuinely a good compromise. Plus, it was cheaper than my 18G and the turbo that I initially was going to get. I will say that the slower spool is noticeable, but it's not an overwhelming difference. On the track, I actually put down the same lap times as I did with the 18G, which for me was really important because I did not want to lose that 108.5 benchmark that I set previously. And I'm still waiting on Blausch to get back to me on why the turbo failed. So once they get back to me, I'll get back to you. Now if I can get it rebuilt or rebuild it myself, I'll probably save it for the bug out project, which is pretty cool. Alright, so I hope this video helped with your projects or you just learned something. Feel free to subscribe, like, and share so Team Never Stop Learning can keep growing. And with that being said, stay tuned and thanks for watching.